Part 1, Faith in the Wilderness, the Church and the Soul of the Colonies, almost equals 10,000 characters. When the first English ships touched the shores of the New World, they didn't just bring tools, weapons, and dreams of fortune. They carried something far more powerful, faith. Religion was not a decoration of colonial life, it was its heartbeat. Whether you were a Puritan in Massachusetts, a Quaker in Pennsylvania, or an Anglican in Virginia, the church shaped how you worked, how you governed, how you thought, even how you saw your neighbor. Imagine landing on the cold, rocky coast of Massachusetts in the early 1600s. The wind cuts like a knife, the forests whisper with unfamiliar sounds, and behind you is the endless ocean, your only bridge to the world you left behind. For those English Puritans who came aboard the Mayflower and the ships that followed, faith was their anchor. They weren't just escaping persecution, they were building what they called a city upon a hill, a community so godly that it would serve as an example for all of England. The Puritans believed God had chosen them for a divine mission. Every sermon, every law, every act of daily life was tied to their covenant with Him. In the meeting house, the center of every town, colonists worshipped, debated, and made decisions. Church and government were woven together so tightly that they were nearly the same thing. Attendance at Sunday services wasn't optional, it was mandatory. The sermons were long, sometimes lasting 2 hours or more, and they weren't light-hearted inspiration, they were fiery, thundering warnings about sin, duty, and God's wrath. But for all their religious passion, Puritan colonies were not places of tolerance. The same people who fled England to escape the Church's oppression soon became oppressors themselves. Those who disagreed with Puritan doctrine, like Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, were banished. Williams fled into the wilderness and founded Rhode Island, a place where he promised freedom of conscience for all. It became one of the first truly religiously tolerant colonies in America, a radical idea at a time when belief could mean life or death. Religion shaped not just laws but the rhythm of daily life. The Sabbath, the sacred day of rest, was strictly observed. No cooking, no travel, no unnecessary work. Children were taught to fear sin and memorize scripture. Ministers were among the most respected, and feared, figures in the community. The colonial meeting house was both church and town hall, a symbol of how deeply faith guided civic life. Farther south, the story looked different. In Virginia and the Carolinas, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was the official faith. Religion here wasn't about creating a holy community so much as maintaining social order. Wealthy landowners, often called planters, funded elegant brick churches that dotted the countryside. Attendance was expected, but enforcement was lighter. For many, church was as much about status and community as salvation. You'd see the local gentry arrive in fine carriages, dressed in imported silks, exchanging greetings before the service began. The sermons reinforced hierarchy. God had ordained everyone's place, master, servant, enslaved person, and the good Christian obeyed their duty. And yet, beneath that surface of order, something was stirring. The Anglican Church was far from the only faith that found its way to the South. Baptists and Presbyterians began to spread among poor farmers and frontier settlers. Their fiery preaching, emotional conversions, and promises of spiritual equality appealed to people who felt left out of the rigid class system. This quiet revolution would later explode into what historians call the Great Awakening, a massive wave of religious revival that would sweep across the colonies in the 18th century. But that's a story for another part. For now, it's enough to say that colonial religion was not uniform, it was a mosaic. In Maryland, for example, the story of faith was deeply political. The colony had been founded by Lord Baltimore as a haven for English Catholics, a minority despised and persecuted back home. For a time, Maryland became a rare place where Catholics and Protestants could coexist. The Act of Toleration in 1649 granted freedom of worship to all Christians, an extraordinary step toward religious liberty. But it didn't last. As waves of Protestant settlers arrived, tensions rose, and the law was repealed. Even in a land of supposed freedom, faith still divided. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, a different kind of experiment was underway. William Penn, a Quaker, founded his colony on principles of peace, equality, and tolerance. Quakers believed that every person carried an inner light, a spark of God within, and that no one needed priests or rituals to reach him. They refused to swear oaths, to bear arms, or to show deference to social rank. Their meetings were silent until the Spirit moved someone to speak. In England, they'd been imprisoned and beaten. In America, they built a society that promised liberty for all, including people of other faiths. Penn's holy experiment became one of the most religiously diverse places in the New World, welcoming German Lutherans, French Huguenots, and Jewish merchants alike. Religion in the colonies wasn't confined to churches or sermons. It was a moral code, a social contract, and sometimes, a weapon. The church helped justify colonization itself. Many Europeans believed they were bringing Christianity, and therefore civilization, to heathen lands. Missionaries traveled among Native Americans, eager to convert them. Some did so with genuine compassion, others served colonial power. The results were mixed. Some tribes adopted Christian teachings into their own traditions, while others resisted fiercely, seeing missionaries as the vanguard of cultural destruction. And for the enslaved Africans who began arriving in the 1600s, religion would become both a tool of control and a source of hope. Slaveholders often used the Bible to justify slavery, citing verses about obedience. But the enslaved people heard another message in the scriptures, the story of Exodus, of God freeing his people from bondage. In whispered prayers and secret gatherings, they found in Christianity a language of resistance, a faith that promised that the oppressor's power was not eternal. Religion also shaped the way colonists saw the future. Many truly believed they were part of a divine plan, that their small towns and fragile settlements were stepping stones toward a new kind of world, one guided by God's will rather than kings. The very idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that America had a special mission, has its roots in those early Puritan dreams. But faith was not just comfort, it was conflict. The colonies were full of debates, about what was true religion, who had the right to preach, and how much power the church should hold. Dissenters like the Baptists and Quakers challenged the dominance of official churches. Women like Anne Hutchinson defied ministers by claiming that God spoke directly to her. And preachers thundered from pulpits that sin, whether personal or collective, could bring God's judgment upon the entire community. If you lived in a New England village in the 1600s, you might wake up to the ringing of the meetinghouse bell, calling you to worship. You'd walk with your family along the dirt path, dressed in your best clothes, Bible in hand. Inside, men sat on one side, women on the other. The air was cold, the wooden benches hard. The minister, often the most educated man in town, would stand before you and read from the scriptures in a deep, steady voice. Every word mattered. You listened not just for comfort, but for survival. Because in that harsh wilderness, faith wasn't a Sunday pastime, it was the difference between despair and endurance. The church built schools, too, because reading the Bible required literacy. Harvard College, founded in 1636, was created to train Puritan ministers. Education was, in a sense, a religious duty. Every colony had its own way of merging faith and learning. Puritans made reading the scriptures a civic requirement, while Quakers emphasized moral education and equality for both sexes, a radical idea for the time. By the end of the 1600s, religion had become one of the most defining, and dividing, features of life in the American colonies. Faith guided their laws, their punishments, their schools, their wars, and even their dreams of freedom. Yet the seeds of something new were already being sown, the idea that belief should be personal, not imposed, that the soul's relationship with God belonged to the individual, not the state. That idea would take another century to fully bloom, in revival tents, frontier chapels, and finally, in the very Constitution of the United States. But its roots go back to these first fragile settlements, to the Puritan sermons, the Quaker meetings, the Catholic masses in Maryland, and the songs of enslaved people whispered under the stars. Faith, in all its forms, had built the foundation of a nation still struggling to define what freedom truly means. Part 2, The Great Awakening and the Rise of Religious Freedom. By the early 1700s, the American colonies were no longer the small, fragile outposts they had once been. They were growing, bustling towns, expanding farms, and a rising middle class. The children of the first settlers had become merchants, planters, and craftsmen. They still went to church, of course, but something had changed. Religion had grown comfortable. The fiery passion that had once driven the Puritans and Quakers was cooling into routine. Sermons became predictable, pews were half-filled, and for many colonists, faith felt more like duty than devotion. Then, like a sudden storm rolling across the Atlantic, came the Great Awakening. It began quietly, with a few preachers, a few gatherings, but soon it swept through the colonies like wildfire. People said the Spirit of God had returned to America. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts and George Whitefield, the English evangelist, lit that fire. Their message was simple, but electrifying: every soul could be saved, not through birth, or wealth, or church membership, but through a direct, emotional encounter with God. Let's set the scene. It's 1740. You're standing in a field in the colony of Connecticut. Thousands of people, farmers, merchants, slaves, servants, even Native Americans, have gathered under a gray sky. A traveling preacher steps forward, his voice carrying across the crowd without a microphone, without a church roof. He isn't speaking in Latin or quoting long theological texts. He's shouting about sin, salvation, and the burning need to be born again. The crowd trembles. People weep, shout, and fall to their knees. Some faint. Others cry out in joy. It's not quiet, dignified worship anymore, it's raw, emotional, personal. For the first time, ordinary men and women feel like they have a direct line to God, without a priest, without a bishop, without the permission of any church authority. Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, captured the terror and wonder of this new faith. He spoke calmly, without theatrics, but his words painted a terrifying picture. Every human soul, he said, hangs over the pit of hell as a spider over the fire, held only by the hand of God. It was not a comforting message, but it was powerful. It made people feel. It reminded them that religion wasn't about formality or ritual, it was about the soul's trembling encounter with the divine. And then came George Whitefield. If Edwards was the mind of the awakening, Whitefield was its voice. He was a master of drama, a preacher who could make crowds of 20,000 weep with a single phrase. He crossed the Atlantic 13 times, traveling up and down the colonies, preaching under open skies, in courtyards, even in city streets. Benjamin Franklin, though not a deeply religious man, once calculated that Whitefield's booming voice could be heard by more than 30,000 people at once, without amplification. Whitefield didn't care about denominations or hierarchies. He preached to everyone, rich and poor, enslaved and free, men and women. He thundered that salvation was open to all who sought it. For enslaved Africans in the colonies, his message carried a dangerous kind of hope, that before God, no one was lesser. The Great Awakening broke down barriers that had divided colonial society for decades. It cut across class lines, ethnic lines, and even geographic lines. The son of a Virginia planter and the daughter of a New England blacksmith might both find themselves weeping beside each other in the same revival tent. But it also caused deep tension. Established ministers, especially in the Anglican and Congregationalist churches, were horrified. They called the revivalists enthusiasts, accusing them of chaos and emotional excess. Some churches split entirely. Congregations divided between the old lights, those who preferred the old, rational religion, and the new lights, who embraced emotional revival. These splits were painful, but they planted something new in American soil, the idea that individuals could choose their own form of faith. No longer was the church something imposed from above. It was something you joined, or left, by conviction. And with that, the seeds of religious freedom began to sprout. The awakening didn't just change religion, it changed how people thought about authority. If a farmer or a servant could stand up and preach that the Spirit had touched him directly, why should only the wealthy and educated lead? If everyone's soul mattered equally before God, then perhaps everyone's voice mattered equally in politics, too. It's no coincidence that many of the same people who cheered the Great Awakening's preachers would later cheer for the Revolution's cries of liberty. Religion, in other words, was becoming democratic. On the frontier, itinerant preachers carried this new message westward. They built rough-hewn chapels, held camp meetings that lasted for days, and spread the idea that the colonies were part of a divine destiny, a new promised land. In these gatherings, women began to play a greater role too. They prayed publicly, exhorted their neighbors, and organized religious societies. It was one of the first cracks in the rigid gender hierarchies of colonial life. The Great Awakening also touched education. New colleges sprang up to train this new generation of passionate ministers. Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, and Rutgers all traced their roots to revival movements. These schools became incubators not just for theology, but for ideas of liberty, reason, and moral duty, ideas that would soon blend into the political language of the Revolution. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. The established churches, especially in colonies with state-sponsored religion, fought back. In Virginia, for instance, the Anglican Church still collected taxes from all citizens, even those who weren't Anglicans. Dissenters like Baptists and Presbyterians were harassed, fined, even jailed for preaching without a license. But their resistance, and the sympathy they inspired, only strengthened the movement for religious liberty. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were a patchwork of faiths. There were Puritans, Quakers, Baptists, Lutherans, Catholics, Jews, and countless small sects and offshoots. And increasingly, they were learning to live side by side. That didn't mean harmony, religious disputes still ran deep, but it did mean tolerance was becoming a habit. As the revolutionary period approached, some of the most influential American thinkers began to imagine a future where government and religion would no longer be tied together. Men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had grown up watching how religious establishments bred conflict. They admired faith, but they feared the power of the church over the state. Even so, religion remained central to the colonial identity. Churches were the beating heart of local communities. They hosted schools, town meetings, and charity efforts. They offered comfort in times of war, famine, or plague. When the French and Indian War erupted in the 1750s, ministers urged their congregations to see the conflict as a test of faith, a battle for the soul of the New World. By the 1760s, the Awakening's energy had softened, but its legacy endured. America had become a place where spiritual independence was now seen as a right. People spoke more openly about conscience, about choice, and about the sacred equality of all believers. And when colonists began to resist British rule, they drew on the language of religion, of covenant, of liberty, of divine justice. Pamphlets and sermons during the early Revolution often sounded like religious revivals. Patriots called the struggle against tyranny a holy cause. Ministers thundered that freedom itself was God's gift, and to submit to oppression was to betray His design. The same preachers who once shouted about salvation were now shouting about liberty. The Great Awakening had done more than fill pews, it had prepared minds. It had taught Americans to question authority, to think for themselves, to trust in their own experience of truth. In that way, the revival of the 1740s paved the road to the revolution of the 1770s. Faith had started as obedience, but it had become the engine of independence. As the century closed and the fires of the Revolution began to burn, the colonies stood on the edge of a new age, one that would transform not just their government, but their understanding of faith itself. Soon, the question would no longer be which church ruled the colonies, but whether any church should rule at all. Part 3, From Revolution to Religious Freedom, the Birth of a New Ideal, almost equals 10,000 characters. When the first shots of the American Revolution echoed across the fields of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the struggle was not only political, it was spiritual. The cry for liberty had grown out of pulpits as much as from pamphlets. Preachers had taught generations of colonists that they were a chosen people, bound by covenant to God, and destined for freedom. Now, that spiritual conviction turned into revolution. In the years leading up to independence, sermons were among the most powerful weapons of persuasion. Colonial ministers framed the fight against Britain as a sacred duty, a defense of God-given rights. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, became a common refrain, echoing from pulpits in Boston, Philadelphia, and beyond. Religion didn't just bless the revolution, it gave it moral fire. But the war also exposed deep questions. If freedom was a gift from God, should it belong to everyone? Could a nation truly claim to fight for liberty while still enslaving others, while denying freedom of belief to those who worshipped differently? The revolution forced Americans to confront the contradictions within their own faith. Let's step back for a moment to imagine the world of 1776. The colonies had grown from a handful of small settlements into a population of over 2 million people. The spiritual landscape was a patchwork: Anglican churches in Virginia, Congregationalists in New England, Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies, Catholics in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and dozens of smaller denominations scattered across the frontier. Each group had its own traditions, rituals, and view of authority. But when Thomas Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, he didn't invoke the authority of any one church. Instead, he appealed to a higher, more universal faith, the laws of nature and of nature's God. It was a deliberate choice. America's revolutionaries believed their rights were not granted by monarchs or priests, but by the Creator himself, a God who stood above all institutions. This idea, that every human being possesses inherent rights given by God, was revolutionary in itself. It transformed religion from a tool of authority into a foundation for equality. The same divine spark that revivalists had preached about during the Great Awakening now became the moral core of a new political philosophy. Yet, not everyone agreed on what religious liberty should mean. In some colonies, established churches still collected taxes and wielded power. In Virginia, for instance, the Anglican Church had been the official faith for over a century. Even after independence, its ministers expected to continue receiving state support. But dissenters, especially Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers, fought back. They argued that true freedom could not exist unless government and religion were separated. Their champion was Thomas Jefferson, joined by James Madison. Jefferson had long believed that no man should be compelled to support or attend any church. In 1779, he drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It declared that, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever." It took several years of political struggle, but in 1786 the statute became law, a triumph not just for Virginia, but for the entire American experiment. Jefferson would later call it one of his 3 greatest achievements, right alongside writing the Declaration of Independence and founding the University of Virginia. Why? Because the statute marked a radical shift, the end of religious establishment and the beginning of a new age of conscience. When the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, the founders followed this principle. The document contained no mention of God or any church authority. It was a stunning omission in an age when almost every nation on earth tied its identity to religion. For the first time in history, a government was being built without a national church. Still, many Americans worried this new government might eventually favor one religion over another. So when the Bill of Rights was drafted, the very first amendment addressed the issue directly. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. With those words, the First Amendment guaranteed both freedom of religion and freedom from religion. No one could be forced to worship, and no faith could claim dominance. This did not mean that religion disappeared from American life. Far from it. Churches remained the moral backbone of their communities. Ministers still preached on Sundays, families still prayed at dinner tables, and revivals still flared up across the frontier. But for the first time, faith belonged to the people, not to the state. And as the nation expanded westward, that freedom gave birth to an astonishing diversity. On the frontier, itinerant preachers traveled from town to town, holding open-air revivals under the stars. These gatherings often lasted for days, filled with song, shouting, and prayer. The Second Great Awakening, as historians would later call it, swept across the early republic in the early 1800s, reigniting the emotional fire of faith. Camp meetings became massive social events, drawing farmers, families, and travelers from miles away. But the effects of this revival went beyond religion. It fueled reform movements, the fight against slavery, the push for women's rights, and the rise of temperance campaigns. Once again, religion became the conscience of the nation, urging Americans to live up to their ideals of liberty and justice. Freedom of religion also opened the door for faiths beyond Christianity. Jewish congregations flourished in cities like New York and Charleston. Catholic immigrants began arriving from Ireland and Germany, building their own churches and schools. Later, in the 19th century, new religious movements, from Mormonism to spiritualism, would arise from the uniquely free soil of America. This pluralism, this ability for countless beliefs to coexist, became one of the defining features of the new nation. Yet it wasn't always peaceful. Catholics faced prejudice, Jews were excluded from office in some states, and even different Protestant denominations clashed. Freedom, it turned out, was not the same as acceptance. But the idea of religious liberty, enshrined in law, gave every faith the right to exist and grow. By the early 19th century, foreign observers were amazed. In Europe, wars were still being fought over religion. Monarchs still dictated how their subjects worshipped. But in America, churches sprang up on every corner, each preaching in its own way, and the government remained neutral. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French writer who toured America in the 1830s, marveled at this balance. Religion in America takes no direct part in the government of society, he wrote, but it must be regarded as the first of their political institutions. He saw what the founders had hoped for, that faith, freed from compulsion, could thrive through choice. The story of religion in early America is, at its heart, the story of freedom, not freedom from belief, but freedom to believe. From the Puritan meetinghouses of New England to the revival tents of Kentucky, from the quiet Quaker meetings in Pennsylvania to the Catholic masses in Maryland, every colony had wrestled with the same question: how can people of different faiths live together in peace? The answer wasn't found overnight. It took conflict, courage, and compromise. But by the time the Constitution was ratified, the colonies had achieved something unprecedented, a society where belief was a personal right, not a political requirement. And yet, even as this ideal took root, the contradictions persisted. The same nation that promised freedom of religion denied freedom to millions of enslaved Africans. For them, faith remained both a refuge and a rebellion, a source of strength in the face of inhumanity. In their secret gatherings and spirituals, they reshaped Christianity itself, infusing it with the hope of deliverance. Their songs, "Go Down, Moses, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," carried echoes of the Exodus story, transforming pain into prophecy. As generations passed, the role of religion in American life continued to evolve. Churches became centers of community, education, and reform. Faith inspired both progress and conflict, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement centuries later. But through all these changes, one truth remained: the idea that no power on earth should stand between a person and their God. It is one of the great paradoxes of American history, that a nation built by deeply religious settlers found its truest strength not in any one faith, but in the freedom to hold many. From the Puritans' Covenant to the First Amendment, from revival fires to constitutional law, the story of religion in America is the story of a people learning, slowly, painfully, triumphantly, that the light of faith shines brightest when it burns freely. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.